In today's business world, change is the only constant, and mastering transformation is the ultimate key to success. Welcome to Shift and Thrive. I'm your host, Natalie Nathanson. Each week, we'll bring you conversations with CEOs who delve into how they successfully drove critical change in their organization. This show is sponsored by Magnitude Consulting, bringing you the thinking power of a growth consultancy and the getting it done power of a full-service B2B marketing agency. I am psyched to bring you today's guest. He is an accomplished entrepreneur who grew his last venture, PackBack, from 0 to 20 million in ARR and over 2.5 million users on their platform. The company was impressively ranked in Fast Company's top 10 most innovative companies in education. He's currently leading his latest venture, Impruve, which is aimed at revolutionizing coaching and feedback. He's also co-host of a brand new podcast called Opening the C-Suite. And he's even done business with Shark Tank's renowned Mark Cuban. Listen up as we dive into his insights on entrepreneurship, innovation, and building for impact. Please welcome Mike Shannon to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Natalie. Excited to be here.
Thank you. Great to have you. And, I can't wait to dive into the discussion today. And really wanted to start by asking you, what is the biggest misconception out there about driving significant change in an organization?
Ooh, good question. The biggest misconception of driving change in an organization. Here's what comes to my mind. I think for me, like coming up as an entrepreneur, business student, the perception that I had that I think most people would carry is that there's this like moment that now all of a sudden, like massive dramatic change has to occur. Like this like light bulb aha went off. And I think at times there's such a dramatic new data point that may be true. But the misconception that comes to my mind is the organization really should be like this vehicle that is always changing in small ways. So you're leading a company, you're almost wanting to design this machine of like inputs, discussion around whatever those inputs are, and then experimentation. And even, at the early startup stage, it's a little harder to do the other experiments because you have to like narrow the focus of the organization on the one really hard thing that you're trying to achieve. But the misconception that all of a sudden now it's time to change. And my first company, PackBack, sort of had that. We totally pivoted the business, which we'll go in. But rather than it being this one moment, I think the machine of constant inputs, constant then small experimentation, while you still have one foot in the old world and you're trying, some of the new things, that's what leads to what can be like overall transformational change. But I don't think it's this one like aha moment and huge arduous work that we just like are starting on Tuesday. Maybe it reaches that point, or it certainly does, but the small iterations over time, you want an organization to be constantly transforming. And so that's, I think, a matter of org and management design, rather than like, oh shoot, we're going to die if we don't have this transformation on Tuesday.
Yeah, that's great input. And I think there's both, right? The gradual kind of step-by-step change and then kind of the bigger ones needed. I like what you're saying about, right, change is always happening. Can you talk a little bit about that organizational design? How do you think about that? How do you plan for those kind of constant iterations?
Yeah, sure. So like even today, okay, I'm at the ground floor of my next startup, and there was kind of an interesting change because I was CEO of my previous company. We were about 120 people. We had, different sort of incubation resources to be constantly trying things. All of a sudden, it's me and the co-founder. And so there's not like, a side incubation team, but even now it's like, okay, you think, certainly with a long-term vision, but with like a shorter term experimentation mode. It's the old, like, strong opinions loosely held. And so, we will be, let's say, we're testing who are like go-to-market audiences. We're building an AI sidekick for frontline managers that basically, inserts a large language model in the right moments for managers that can give them guidance on, how to coach their teams better, who's, in need of some feedback, what their to-dos are. And so we thought we had like one entry point, right? At first we were focused on sales managers, and we're still very keen on sales managers. But as we've like experimented around, we found like different entry points that maybe, receive the overall mission in a different way, have different plugins to the organization. So the point is, I didn't want to start by just like, kind of scattered approach, reaching out to everybody in an organization. And so we started with like one profile. We kind of moved to the next, Okay, now that we've talked to, whatever, the HR manager, okay, we understand that the product needs to do X, Y, Z. Let's pause the outreach for, new users. Let's get product there. So you're like constantly iterating, even though you only have like one kind of laser beam when you're a, early ground floor startup. At the larger company state, not even that much larger. Like when my first company, PackBack, pivoted from being what we were hoping would be a daily e-textbook rental platform to a writing practice discussion tool. That seemed like two pretty disparate things when we tell people like, oh yeah, we were, the textbook rental kids coming out of college, and now we're this writing practice tool. Like, how'd you get to that? The connection was that as we were pursuing licensing rights with the textbook publishers to be the textbook rental company, we were experimenting with like a layer of value on top of our e-reader experience, which was this question and answer forum that we thought would connect students around a textbook at different universities. So we kind of had that thing, like a very V1 MVP being built and experimented with. And then when like the final conclusion after many, series of data points came that we're not going to get the licensing rights to the e-textbooks that we thought we were building a business on. Now we had this like little scrappy tool that a few college professors were using. And we thought, well, let's just see if, that in and of itself, would be of enough value for like professors to start using. And because we had that little experiment going, now we got it in a few users' hands. We started understanding that, hey, there's this bigger problem here where more and more college professors have over 50 or 100 or 1,000 students. And so they can't scale Socratic learning. They can't scale student-driven questions. So what if we add a few algorithms here that auto-moderate this? And like you keep iterating that way. Before we knew it, we had a whole company built on the discussion tool, which was just a little widget of the first product idea when it began.
Those are both great examples. And I think they do have that common thread of really paying attention to the market and capitalizing on evolving opportunities. I want to talk about each of them a little bit more because I do think we have our listeners are kind of CEOs and executives of different company sizes. And I think there's great value from both of those examples. So I think, going backwards, when you talk about testing the audience in those kind of early stages of a business, can you talk a little bit about how you go about that?
Sure. So there's probably more like formatted experimental ways to do this. I mean, I really think the lean startup, kind of remains a blueprint. There's obviously been like a lot more content and stuff that's come out over the years. When I started as an entrepreneur, that was like the hot new book. But it's really like you figure out, okay, what is the hypothesis that we're going after? I think in some ways the purpose or vision, maybe doesn't ever need to change. Like with Impruve, we have this, kind of purpose statement of make great coaching a habit. The tactics by which we achieve that, can change 100 times, and that can stay our mission. With PackBack, we had awaken and fuel lifelong curiosity, and there are different tactics, but the mission stayed the same. So, at the ground floor, what we do is we'll just kind of come to a loose definition of what we think validation or new signals would be. And so the way we operate, and this is the same thing I did with PackBack with the larger exec team, is we have this Monday morning kickoff meeting. It's formatted after, I like the book Traction or Entrepreneurial Operating System, formatted after that level 10 meeting. So that like the main thing is that there's an issues list. And so any like data points that we're gathering from users or building the product, sales, whatever, whatever is happening, the issues go into the list. We order what's the highest priority. And so we're going through the issues. We're going through our OKRs, what's red, yellow, or green, or not serving us anymore. And because we just go through that cycle every week, what inevitably happens is we'll say, okay, this hypothesis it probably has enough of a data point that it's not working or we should change. I'll give you an example that we've already occurred with Impruve. When we started Impruve, this mission, make great coaching a habit, the first thing we were keen on is lower the friction to feedback actually getting out. Because if we can lower the friction to it actually getting out of a manager's head, well, now there's like more at bats in practice, and we can do a lot of cool things to improve the craft of it. But my experience when I had like more and more employees with PackBack was I just had more observations and I felt like I was communicating out. And I thought typing was one of the friction points. Like I just wouldn't get around to typing up that Slack or that email. And so I got, kind of interested in voice memos because I could just be walking to the train, do a quick voice memo, kick it out to somewhere. But the problem was whether I did that or Slack or whatever, it wasn't being tracked anywhere. So then by the time I got to performance reviews, I'm like, I can't remember what affirmations I gave or constructive feedback. So V1 of Impruve was really nothing else but a voice to text tool that was then compiling a database of transcripts of little feedback moments. And what we thought was we'll do a lot of cool stuff with a large language model, creating a sidekick out of those transcripts. What we learned pretty quickly was that a voice memo tool on its own was too far out of workflow and still too unnatural of a behavior for most of the frontline managers that we were testing with. And so it was like, I thought I'm removing friction by giving this voice memo tool. In reality, for most of our test users, a voice memo was still kind of uncomfortable. You're like coming up with the thoughts as you go. I was doing that all the time because I'd gotten immune to it. But we were finding managers like doing a voice to text memo, but not sharing the voice, which was part of the human touch that we thought, was going to be necessary. So point being, like that first version, it didn't take too long for us to say, you know what, there might be some application to like a voice to text tool in the right moments, but we're going to need to move beyond that. And so, it was like, okay, next thing up.
Yep, that's great. It's helpful to hear. Really, it underscores, I would say, that openness to change and always listening for what's the feedback you're getting and how do you evolve
Sure.
the
Yeah.
product and the focus accordingly.
Yeah. I'll add one thing to that. Something that's on my mind right now is the amount of cycles that you can get in building a business. So if you're pitching a business to investors, right? Some of like, the key things in there is what's the market size? Like, is there a competitive mode on the product? What's the actual go to market? Do you have a unique advantage of getting to the first users, customers? Something that I never really thought about in our first business, but then we learned the hard way is that, in the just dynamics of a business that you're building, there's going to be some kind of like hard coded, restraints on how many cycles of these learning moments that we're talking about you can get through. So in theory, what I'm talking about here of like, let me spin up a manager on a voice, to text tool. What I was really attractive is like, we could start that manager in a cycle in February and then in March and then in April. And in theory, we could have like monthly cycles where we're going through these learnings, we're iterating and changing. One of the biggest challenges we had with PackBack books, the e-textbook rental first concept in my last company, was our cycles of iteration and change were inherently going to be slower because they were baked in two slow moving things. One, we had to get these big licensing agreements from where we're only like 3 or 4 major textbook publishers. And two, when we want to then test the handful of books that give us access to, we couldn't test until the fall semester began. And then we couldn't do test 2 until the spring semester began in January. And because there were only a few weeks between the ending of the fall semester in December and the start of the spring in January, sometimes there wasn't enough time. Actually, it always wasn't enough time for then the publisher to analyze the results and decide if we're expanding the pilot a few weeks. So now we're missing that spring cycle, and it's all the way until the next fall that we have the next cycle. So what I tell people, for 4 years, we're trying to do this e-textbook thing. It's like, how did you not come to a better conclusion? And part of it was lack of experience, but part of it was across 4 years, we really only had like 3 or 4 actual learning cycles of testing something, getting the results, doing a V2 test. So like now building a business, I'm so keen on, all right, can we get, 6 cycles in a year versus 2 or 4? Can we get 8? Can we get up to 12? And so like how many cycles you do in a year, I think will determine like how fast the company transforms into something legitimate.
I am glad you brought that up because I think that cycle of iteration is really helpful to think about and to plan and go in with eyes wide open in a business, right? Whether it's kind of seasonality or your target market's budgeting cycles or the time to impact from using that product or service is really needing to align to that. I'm wondering if you feel like that's kind of baked into the business constraints, or is there something like thinking of the PackBack example, anything you could have done differently to accelerate those cycles?
Oh boy, we've thought and chewed on it a lot. And it's not to like, I always want to have self ownership of like, hey, well, what could we be doing better? I do think that some things are seasonal. Like, I joke sometimes the last, industry or business I try to disrupt is like TurboTax because it's, from my view on the sidelines, I guess it's like a one season business. I'm sure there's other things that happen throughout the year, but like I use TurboTax once a year. So to try to get me away from TurboTax, like a competitor would like get one shot at me and then like, all right, whatever, we're going to go another year. So with like PackBack, even as we got to the discussion tool, like we could move things faster, right? Like now we had summer classes that could start. There was some quarters. So there's ways like, yeah, you try to find different pockets, that either have like, other start points, or you try to iterate the product so that it doesn't have to start like day one for us in ed tech at the start of the semester. Maybe there's something where like it can start mid semester. The problem was, you can't change too much behavior when you're introducing a tool to the market. And so for us to introduce like, hey, now use our writing practice tool midway through a semester, and you've got this 6-week, 16-week course that's already designed. Like it was so hard to try to do anything that was out of the cadence of the semester start. And it was frankly even hard to get somebody in the early days to start our tool in like the spring semester, which is halfway through the year. They'd say, hey, I do all my changes at the beginning of fall, and then it's like that year. So, I don't know, Natalie, we probably should have called you up and you could have given us some ideas, but, yeah, we were constantly trying to like do retros in middle of, a semester to see like what could change in our sales campaign. But, some things were pretty hard coded seasonal. And so I just think that a lot of like, all right, what market do you go into? Are we going to be limited on the cycles of iteration? Or is it going to free flow to like, 12 in a year?
Right, right. And I think working with any of those constraints, you're at least going in with that plan and understanding what do you need to have in place to be able to align to those cycles. I think you touched on kind of changing the behaviors of the target market. That's hard, just like any kind of change management is hard, but even more when you're trying to get your solution into new hands of the target market.
Yeah. And what's your cost model? I mean, it's not to say like, hey, you can never go into a market that has, like seasonal, there's always going to be like seasonal sales. But I think as a startup, then building a cost model around that. So for us, we were trying things and raising capital for this like PackBack books concept. Um, in some ways, maybe more like aggressively than what fit the seasonality or the cycles of iteration. So like we could have been testing, all right, we've got 10 books from whatever major publisher. And now, we're going to try to test if it's getting them net positive revenue from the used book market or whatever. We probably could have done that actually in like a much leaner cost model. Frankly, like we probably even just kept working other jobs while trying that out. Like we were all in as entrepreneurs and we had some capital raised, but I think the way to do it, if you're going to have to go through those slower cycles, is like really go lean on your cost model until you've got the signal that we're growing. We would be like building things up, expecting after this semester pilot, the floodgates are going to open and we're going to have now 10,000 titles. So we need to be ready for all of that, brand presence on campus, all that. Like in reality, it was taking longer to just even get the signal. So we probably could have just operated more leanly.
Yeah, yeah. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the biggest change that you've driven in an organization, and you're talking about this with PackBack and kind of the business model change. I wanted to see if you can talk about kind of how did you do that? You're right. How did you manage the different expectations, whether that's kind of with the internal team, with clients? It sounds like a very big change that you were navigating there.
Yeah, yeah. So I gave, kind of the context of how, all right, we started with this widget of, a discussion tool that was on top of e-textbooks. Still the e-textbook rental was the main thing. And once that hit a, kind of final brick wall, then it was, oh, can we just get this discussion thing out into market? So that was like, iterative, gradual, like change and experimentation. But there was then like, the kind of bigger moment of when it was clear that, hey, we're shutting down, the kind of old world thought and we're going all in on the new thing. And when that happened, like, yeah, there was some, I don't think we even realized it at the time, but like, change management, communications and efforts and meetings and stuff that had to go into place. My co-founder, Jessica Tenuta, really did the best job spearheading this. So a few things happened. One, the vision and mission had to change. Like we were no longer about saving students money on textbooks. We were about awaken and fuel curiosity. We didn't start the business with those words. And so sometimes I say like we even discovered our purpose. But if I think about the key moments that like shifted the culture and the identity of PackBack, Jessica gave a TEDx talk at a state university that became almost like our battle cry around curiosity and around student questions. So it's like, all right, we had that piece down where we have like the voice. That was like Jessica's voice and message. There was investor communications. I probably had at the time, like, 30 plus angel investors that invested in a, e-commerce business around e-textbooks. And so, we were always doing like monthly or quarterly investor updates. I can remember, crafting that of wanting to explain like, here's how we got here. Here's where we're putting resources. Here's where we think the opportunity is, the hypothesis. And then there's internal like team. So we actually didn't have the team structure that was really like necessary now for a discussion in a software sale. We had, roles that were now sort of irrelevant. We had a campus ambassador program that wasn't really going to be our go-to-market. So we didn't realize that fast enough. I think the team actually did. We had about like half the team. We were small. We're probably 15 people. Half the team left. And, more in like, all right, I just don't know if this thing is going to work or not. It's not what I signed up for. And that ended up being like, a pretty good gift because the instinct to say, hey, like we're going to actually drive a company change and we're going to restructure the org. So it kind of happened naturally. And then we did a series of things like we had our first company retreat. We did, again, Jessica, I can remember leading an exercise on defining our company values, putting the words to our company purpose, painting the vision of where we were going and who wanted to be in on that. And so you have that kind of tough stuff because it's hard when all of a sudden half the team leaves and you're not sure if the other half is going to leave too. You don't have a ton of funding left. You have a little bit of runway, but you've got to, keep faith with investors to, hey, like come along with us for this next thing. So those were some of the moments that I remember.
Yeah, that's helpful, and I'm sure that'll resonate with other listeners. Just thinking about the different stakeholder audiences and how you need to navigate that with
Totally.
folks.
Totally.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the different roles. I know you were a small company, but how did you think about the different parts of the organization and whether that was existing team members that needed to change what they were doing or bringing in new skill sets? How did you think about that across kind of the core functions of the business?
Well, the most material, change because we kept like the same engineering team and, added to it a little bit. We had never had a sales team. And, I could probably argue that we were maybe even still too early, but, we decided to hire 3 sales reps, with the kind of remaining resources that we had. And the reason for 3 was that we wanted, some true experimentation. So if you hire like one, like your first sales rep, obviously the founders have been selling it already. So we've got some validation point. But then to hire 3 sales reps, the experimentation was you don't want to have like, just a false negative or a false positive if you only hire, one rep. You don't know if it's just on that individual's ability. So that was like a, sizable investment to say, hey, 3 sales reps, and the founders will keep selling. And let's see, this was like in middle of the summer of 2015 with the fall semester beginning, in September or late August, which nowadays we look at that and say, way too late in the sales cycle to hire anybody. But we didn't know what we were doing yet. It was like new market. So that was the most material thing was, okay, I remember even when we hired the individuals, one of the lines was, hey, we don't know if this role is going to exist literally in like 3 to 6 months from now. We're doing an experiment. So luckily we found the right kind of people that were, like, okay, let me try the experiment and see if I can build this with you. But so that was one of the first material things. As the company grew, right? So then we finally got a grip on selling this discussion tool into higher ed as a professor adoption tool. And then it's either like kicked over to tuition fees or the student pays or the school pays. But once we had that, we started just like cranking that engine as much as we could. So we got that to, $1 million revenue. Then we did a small series A. We got it to, 5, 6, 7 million revenue. When we were, getting more around like 10, it became a more material focus that, hey, we need to, in addition to the direct to faculty channel, like we need to have like an enterprise sales arm. We need to kind of de-risk the business in other ways. We eventually also opened up the high school market. So as those things were occurring, again, it's like at a somewhat larger scale, but these experimentations happening. So on the product side, we ended up with a small, we call it incubation team, which had, I think started with like one engineer that was fully on it, but then it was partial bandwidth from our CTO Craig, our Chief Product Officer Jessica. There was like small prototypes being created that we thought could serve then these, new markets or new go-to-market, motions that again, we'd have like 1 or 2 people on. We ended up operating, I was CEO, my co-founder Casey was a chief strategy officer. And like, Casey's role sort of morphed into, he's like the guy that goes, into the forest to try to map out new territory. And so like, enterprise sales, Casey would try to figure that out. And then, we'd add 1 or 2 people from one side of the business over to like, be the trailblazers with Casey. And once we had that, solid enough, it's like, okay, give that more resources, have that give input to the incubation team on product. And so again, it's like this machine that's connected. But you never want to stop the experimentation if you have the bandwidth to it, because again, we thought we were going to hit a ceiling on our core go-to-market motion. If we just wait till we hit it, well, now we like have no momentum to do the next thing.
Right. Sounds like a good model and really allowed you to pay attention to where the opportunity was in the market and then not resting on your laurels at that point and continuing to think one step ahead.
Yeah.
So Mike, I want to jump forward again and talk about your work at Impruve. And you talked about it being early stage company. You are still in that kind of iteration and testing phase. Can you talk about, where you personally are focused on this year? What's kind of the biggest challenge or priority that you're working on?
Yeah, sure. The biggest challenge is, there's so much opportunity, I think, in this moment here where like, the large language models are here. Everybody, is figuring out, okay, now how do you, create this world, in our, case, this working world, where any given employee is as supercharged by AI as they can be. And I come from some relevant experience, which is fun because PackBack evolved into being, really the leading AI assisted writing practice tool. And so now here we are on the employment side, focused on feedback and coaching. So there's some parallels. But yeah, so I gave you a little bit of what we started with, this widget of, feedback on the fly. What Impruve is, today, and we're now starting to work more formally with clients, is, as we say, the AI sidekick that, turbocharges and helps scale the frontline managers. And so what that means is, we think there's this dizziness problem that middle managers come into. I experienced this personally. Saw our managers at PackBack as we scale to 100 plus see it. But it's like there's inputs and requirements from every angle on this frontline manager. And they're the person most critical to growth and execution at a company. So what I mean by that is, I don't know, for our revenue teams at PackBack, we would have all the rev ops data and, these kind of intense meetings where we're trying to digest everything happening on the business side. And then on the coaching and feedback side, it's like, here's all the workshops and trainings that we're putting managers through. Then they have their OKRs and the goals that they really have to go hit. And they've got all the communications with their team members, whatever L&D they're doing on their own. You end up having this like burnt out, just dizzy frontline manager. We think an AI sidekick can gather all those moving parts and just make for us a simpler and more like impactful, scalable workflow for the managers. So what we do is we gather whatever we can, depending on the client, but mainly like the communications that are occurring, which are becoming more and more accessible. So like Slack messages between managers and team members. Where we're moving towards is like more and more meetings are producing transcripts because it's really useful to have the notes out of it. So, okay, give us access to those transcripts. So whatever's happening on the communications, then there's a bit of a kind of like less scalable consultation that occurs with our clients today, which is we craft a custom knowledge base to that company. So that's whatever matters to, the C-suite, HR, middle managers, could be competency models, your OKRs, could be thought leaders like, Radical Candor, Kim Scott. Like there might be thought leaders that they're doing management trainings on that you'd hope, continue to be the method that, managers, lead on mission and values, whatever else. So our tool is constantly cross-referencing what's happening in communications with that custom knowledge base. And then the knowledge base is going to evolve over time too. And then the outputs of this sidekick, which we create almost like a Duolingo type relationship. Duolingo has the parrot or whatever. We've got this koala bear. And the output is everything from like analytics and insight into who you are coaching on your team, on what themes, what's maybe behind. So, there's 6 components of Joey's competency model. HR says that the competency model is only being touched on twice a year in performance reviews. Okay, well, can an AI sidekick keep that more top of mind in, a monthly cadence or biweekly or whatever? So they're getting guidance on like who to coach on what. There's a flow that gives them actually craft help of like how to actually like word the feedback, which is a lot of things managers get stuck on. And word it, guided by whatever frameworks are important to HR, L&D, C-suite. And then, it goes into deeper things. We can draft performance reviews. We can help with to-do lists. And, we're kind of hearing more from clients what they wanted to do, but that's what Impruve's doing, at the moment from a product standpoint. And yeah, like I said, we're kind of testing who the right starting points that different clients are, for the go-to-market.
Yep. Yep. I know there's so much changing in generative AI, and it sounds like you're building kind of at the forefront of both user behaviors and kind of technology capabilities. How do you manage kind of building the company while there's so much changing at the same time?
Yeah, sure. So I have a few thoughts on it, which you could ask me in 6 months, they might change. So, we think like the knowledge base and fine tuning is the way to work with a large language model, not to try to like recreate the wheel, because as soon as, you've say spent all kinds of resources trying to train, a version of you're working with GPT, and then all of a sudden the next one comes out, it's like you're constantly chasing that. And so, we think, hey, be built to evolve with the models, because only a handful of companies are going to actually like build the core large language model. So evolve with how they change. The workflow is like, really the opportunity here of, what is the most convenient way to take the right inputs into that, kind of machine of the large language model, and then in the right convenient workflows without changing behavior, produce the outputs, which could be to-do lists or feedback recommendations or whatever. So now there's this big question when you're building of like, now how do you like keep clients and what's the competitive moat? In theory, any startup has access to the same APIs to the large language model. So the relationship with effectively the interface, in our case, the koala bear, like the relationship with that sidekick, we think is most key. So it's like, how do we customize as much as we can, to the actual user within that client? And then over time, really have like a history of the relationship. And so like, why would I stay with one tool versus the next if I can always be like moving my data? Well, if this sidekick, has gone through a learning curve with me, right? And now it's July and I'm reminded that, hey, remember in April when, you were working through this thing and we were talking about that, you've made great strides. Here's what I think you've done well this past week. Like, part of what's cool is you have these people in thankless jobs, in some cases, frontline managers, in a sidekick can give them affirmations and it can remember, depending on how we program the workflow, it can remember, some of the micro wins that have occurred over time. So, that's something we're keen on is like, what's the long-term relationship? Because the interface is going to evolve. The actual core LLM is going to evolve. But what's the relationship with, our experience and our sidekick, that is going to keep, the managers that we work with, the employees, period, um, you know, loyal to Impruve.
That's really interesting. I think that everyone wants the stickiness of their
Yeah.
platform so that you don't lose users and want to keep them engaged in the platform. Can you talk a little bit more about how you think of relationship? It sounds like you're talking about kind of a personal one-to-one relationship between the technology and the sales rep, kind of beyond the organizational. Is that true? And it's kind of interesting. So I'd love to hear more.
Well, it's still evolving, but what I'm referring to is, so like every week, I'll just take the frontline manager as a use case. Every week they're getting, what we call coaches insights. Coach spelled with a K is the name of our koala sidekick. So they'll get like, coaches insights might be, whatever, a theme that they're working on, a recommendation for feedback this week, something they're behind on. Um, it helps if we have a more fleshed out knowledge base from that company so that we know like, all right, this, whatever, frontline sales manager, here's like what's in the job description for that manager. And, maybe here's something that, the manager is a little bit behind on. We're evolving the product so that we're getting more input from both the employee and the manager too. So like now they can do some of like the classic talent engagement features on Improve, their check-ins, their one-on-one logs, and so we get these inputs and then the key is like, how do you store them so that now the sidekick is cross-referencing, the state of things, call it, or the state of, coaches insights in April, with what's happening in July, like how has that trended over time? And so, I'm sure that will be an evolving answer, 6 months from now. But what I'm, interested in is, hey, can I have my sidekick like give me an affirmation of how I'm progressing on whatever growth theme from a few months back? And so some of this was inspired by like, when I had stepped out of my role at PackBack, I just started this really long thread on a chat GPT and I was asking it, I wanted to get some like basic programming skills just as an experiment. So it was like my coding tutor. And I would ask it to recap, hey, what did we cover yesterday? What did we cover last week? And I would try to see if, I could get it to give me like an affirmation from behind. And I know it's just kind of like in a chat GPT thread, it's just pulling those from the same thread. But there's ways that we think we can actually like itemize some of the feedback moments, store it in a database, draw from it, weeks and months later. And the effect is a, high memory relationship with this sidekick, which is actually unique. It's different than just like porting your data from Slack or whatever into a new, LLM workflow. It's a unique kind of history of the exchanges with our sidekick.
Right, right. I mean, I can empathize even from my own relationship with ChatGPT. And when I started kind of remembering conversations between chats, and all of a sudden you can go back and ask it to bring new information up, or it without even asking, unprompted, will kind of reconnect the dots. It's
Yeah.
amazing how validating and motivating it can be, and you can
Yeah.
quickly forget that it is kind of a tool, right? You start to have an
Yeah.
actual kind of relationship there.
Yeah. And validating, I think, is the right moment. It's absurd. oh, this is just, a dumb computer behind, the interface. But it actually, if you're in a thankless, and not entirely thankless, but like, the frontline manager, again, they're dizzy, they're taking a lot of hits. And if you can craft that thing to be after some of, the best managers, the best methods of like positive affirmation, it's incredibly motivating and fueling for that manager to just like know what they're doing well, and then a few tidbits of what they could do differently from something that is not their direct boss, not tied to their compensation. It's almost like the sidekick is like everybody's like referee between all these interpersonal relationships at a company.
Yeah, yeah. It's it's safe and motivating, which who doesn't want that in their work environment?
Right.
Uh,
I appreciate that.
so Mike, this has been some really fantastic information just about your experience and what you've worked through in your last organizations. I'd love to learn a bit more about you and kind of the leader behind these companies. So, can you tell me like who is Mike Shannon? How did you go from Mike as a kid to where you are today? Did you always know you'd be getting into entrepreneurship? Tell me a bit about you.
Oh, sure, sure. Oh, I don't know. Well, today, yeah, let's see. I'm basically in dad mode. I just started coaching a t-ball team with my wife. We've got two boys, 3-year old and a 1-year old. So when I'm not working on improve or doing some of the writing or content, it's all dad mode, which is a ton of fun. But yeah, for me, as far as like entrepreneurship, I was always somewhere in this like intersection of like sports, which for me was basketball, not because I'm a good basketball player, but I just always loved it, in entrepreneurship. And so, there was a period of time, like I spent 7 seasons as a ball boy for the Chicago Bulls, and that sort of opened some doors to doing stuff in the off season in the NBA, at the training facility, NBA draft combines. And so I had like a crack of a door open that, I could have seen my path go to being like a video analyst, at, and obviously the NBA teams, but all my, friends in the space are pursuing, but, or like a G League team or, NCAA. So I was like somewhere between this world of like basketball and going down that like coaching route. Just loved to coach, youth teams or whatever. And then entrepreneurship to me was always this like fascinating road that was not really constrained by anything. I didn't have like good grades growing up or anything. I didn't want to be in a classroom. It's kind of funny that I ended up in education tech. But yeah, I remember one of the first things was I had like a high school economics class, and the teacher, Mr. Gallo, shout out, showed a documentary of Sam Walton, and that was the first like taste of entrepreneurship that I had. I was just saying like, wow, somebody like started something from nothing. I just knew Walmart is this big thing. And so that sort of like piqued the curiosity. Um, and then, yeah, throughout college, it was like, I'd have these ideas. I remember pitching a boss of mine. I was a deckhand working on, boat tours in Chicago. And I pitched the owner on like opening a coffee shop, and he was like, "You need a lobotomy. That'll never work." I didn't know what a lobotomy was, but he's saying I need brain surgery. And so I always like, I was just like stuck. I would have like ideas at night, and then I'd wake up and talk myself out of it. And so when I finally had like a team, and just like teamed up with a few friends, Casey, Nick, and Jessica, I had enough like peers around me that we all just kept each other going. But yeah, the entrepreneurship bug, I think started early, and it was to me this like big liberating thing of like, oh, okay, it's not like nobody is checking my GPA in a pitch meeting. Like they're checking my traction. And my traction can be driven by me like picking up the phone, and I can pick up the phone. And so yeah, I was pretty keen on entrepreneurship from an early age.
That's interesting. That focus on impact and outcomes, right? It's in your control. Success or failure is in your control, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious, like being a ball boy for the Chicago Bulls, like what kind of experiences did you have? Was there anything there that still sticks with you now in your life of kind of tech entrepreneurship?
Sure, sure. Well, I have a book that's nearly complete in writing that sort of like tells this intersection of I was still on, as I joke, active duty ball boy as we started PackBack. And the like crux of that story is that when my co-founder Casey and I aired on Shark Tank at, a young age, I was 23. Um, the next day after it aired, so it airs, this is like at the peak of Shark Tank. We're young, everybody's watching Shark Tank. We do the deal with Mark Cuban. The next day, I was in the Bulls locker room folding towels, and everybody had seen the show. Like an email went out, or sort of ball boys went at Shark Tank. And so there was a really interesting sort of like collision of worlds there when I was like the ball boy on Shark Tank. Um, but yeah, like, the stories were, it's this whole job. Like you're there 7, 8 hours. You're really an extended part of the training staff. Um, and so I'd get to a 7 o'clock game at, 3 o'clock. I always had to be, first person in. I loved it. Make the Gatorade, fold the towels, do whatever, in the locker room, get things set up. And then it's, helping with the warm-ups. So I got to know, like the video coordinator staff, you get to know the trainers, the coaching staff. And so, in Chicago, we had some really great years. It was like the Derrick Rose, Joakim Noah, Luol Deng years. I came in the same, year. Joakim Noah and I were rookies together. In the next year, Derrick Rose was drafted, but his name doesn't mean anything. But, we had this time where the Bulls then got to be like number one in the league. And then, Derrick Rose got hurt. I was there that game. I was 10 feet away from him in the trainer's room after. And so I don't know. There's these things that definitely like connect to entrepreneurship and like life after, but mainly it was just this, incredible exposure and experience. And, it's kind of fun when all of a sudden now I'm starting a business and doing the Bulls thing.
I'm sure. I'm sure it sounds like quite a ride. And I want to ask you about Shark Tank too, because I
Sure.
think a lot of the kind of CEOs that I talk to have experience pitching, VCs and angels, typically not on national television. So what was that experience like for you?
It's funny. It was a pretty typical pitch. If you take away like, the setting and the context, like, um, we had been pitching all summer by the time we went to film Shark Tank in the fall. I think we had about 300,000 raised, from, yeah, probably like 25 angels. So it was like small checks that we were getting. But the questions, you know, are all the same at a certain point. If you pitch 100 angel investors, like the 80/20 rule, what most of the questions are. So you're almost on like auto, of knowing like what to anticipate, what the answers are. Now we were still polishing that. Like before we went into pitch, I had flashcards I was going through of, whatever. What do you think your ACV is going to be? What do you think, the LTV is going to be? So, we had $20 or $120 in revenue. So we didn't really know any of these things. But the biggest difference was just like the order of it. So most of the time, if I go in to pitch, even if it's like an angel group, there's going to be some like cordial, orderliness to the questions. On Shark Tank, you're there, lights everywhere. So it's this big like adrenaline pump. And then like the train of thought that Mark Cuban is on might be totally different than what was on, or, Kevin O'Leary. And so we knew we wanted Mark Cuban. So we sort of were tailoring to Mark. And so sometimes you're getting two or three questions like at the same time. And it's like, okay, well, but you want to be polite. Like, whose question do I answer? So we usually would go to Mark. But yeah, we were in there for about an hour, and then they air the segment in like 8 minutes. So, a lot gets cut out. But it was like, they were all nice people. Other than the disorder of like the questions, and they wished us well. And Mark, did a deal with us.
That's great. Sounds like you're pitching multiple investors at once, so probably helped to have that focus on who you ideally want to work with. Maybe pitching on steroids to some degree.
Yeah, like it's all in the same vein as just getting into interesting scenarios where you're out of your comfort zone. I just tell college students all the time, like, just, even if you don't have the business plan yet, like, I don't know, to get a door-to-door sales job, do Toastmasters, or I think that's what it's called. Like, whatever you can do to just constantly get out of your comfort zone. And that was like a unique one for us with Shark Tank, but it wasn't the first, it wasn't the last. It's like part of this bag of just like constantly getting, out there and exposed as an entrepreneur, and having to just like, kind of pitch your way through it.
Right. Right. For sure. So, Mike, I want to ask you before we wrap up. We're talking about the different experiences you've had, throughout your entrepreneurial journey. Looking from where you are now, what advice would you give your younger self in your first ever leadership role?
Yeah, sure. The faster cycles thing. Like, I mean, that's it. When people ask, what would you have changed? Because the first business model of Pack My Books didn't work. But, the biggest thing I would change is I would have started, that was senior year that we started business. I would have started something freshman year. I had an idea of like a little waffle stand. There was always a 2 a.m. line around the block at Domino's Pizza. And I just remember thinking, I could probably make waffles of 50 cents, 25 cents each and sell them to some of these kids that want the pizza for like $3. And it's just like, oh, it's not going to be a big business or whatever. I never did it. But even something as small as that, if I would have just started it, that would have been like the start of a cycle. And so like the earlier I could start and in the faster cycles. And so like, yeah, in hindsight, clearly we probably could have gotten the signal that PackBack Books wasn't going to work, a year in versus 4 years in. But yeah, if I were going to go into a different industry, period, it would have been, trying to understand like, okay, how fast can the learning and iteration cycles occur with whatever I'm starting to do? Because it almost doesn't matter where you start. It's like, it's what you discover over time, and your ability to discover it is on those iteration cycles. So that would be it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. So just start because you're going to learn through that. And I think that comment about the faster cycles is one that I think can resonate with everyone, regardless of kind of the industry, is just being clear on what your business cycles are and how do you adapt with that.
That's it.
So thank you, Mike. This was such a great conversation. I'm truly grateful, and we covered a lot of different ground. So thank you for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm a huge fan of the show. Honored to be on it. So thank you, Natalie.
Thank you. And, thank you to everyone listening. I know I loved hearing about Mike's journey, what he's learned along the way, the rapid kind of iteration and transformation that he experienced through PackBack and the pivot that they made and all of the insights he shared around that. And if you, our listeners, learned something today, and I know you did, please tell someone about this episode. Sharing these kinds of insights and information with our peers is how we all get better for each of us as leaders, as well as to help us successfully drive change, innovation, and transformation in our organizations. So thanks again, Mike. And this has been another great episode of Shift and Thrive. See you all next time. That's a wrap for this week's episode. For show notes and more, visit shiftandthrivepodcast.com. A special thank you to our sponsor, Magnitude Consulting, bringing you the thinking power of a growth consultancy and the getting it done power of a full-service marketing agency to help B2B companies fuel their growth. For more information on Magnitude and to get your complimentary transformation readiness assessment, visit magnitudeconsulting.com/getready. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next week.